And it is my honor to welcome you all, as well as Professor Pino and our guest, Ben Clements from the IMF. And this is one of many events in our Leaders on Global Energy lecture series that Professor Pino has helped organize. So let me turn it over now to him, and then we'll have the presentation and then get into some Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you very much for being with us. This is a very interesting lecture on energy subsidies. The motivation, if I can say in 2 words, energy demand is projected to increase by 1/3 in the next 10 to 25 years, and this is a lot. Everybody is concerned with 25% increase. Are there, yes or no, enough resources for that? And there is a big motivation to see what are the market distortions that may be stimulating energy demand. We know that some factors are mispriced or not priced. It's the case of CO2, and some factors are wrongly priced, which is the case of energy subsidies. The IMF has produced a very important research on this area, which was followed by the International Energy Agency, or I don't know if you did it contemporaneously, but now the reference when it comes to speak about energy subsidies, it's the IMF, it's Ben Clements, and I really thank you for having accepted to come from Washington to Columbia. And last but not the least, the IMF is an institution that is very strong in my heart. I've worked there for 5 years. What I am now professionally, in large part, is due to the IMF. So thank you very much for being with us.
But you won't be clapping after you hear what I have to say. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to talk about, say, 25 minutes here about some of the work we've been doing actually across departments of the IMF on energy subsidy reform. And so this really culminated in a book we produced, it just came out in October. And one of the reasons we did this was actually our management frequently meets them with country authorities, and many of them were asking our management, how can I reform energy subsidies? Every time I raise the price of gasoline, there's a riot on the streets. I make 1 step forward, I go 2 steps backward. What can I do to reform energy subsidies in my country? So in some ways, this is a political economy effort of trying to look at where have energy subsidy reforms been successful and not successful. So that's really was the motivation of this, for this. But generally, as kind of economists, we know they're important because they affect the budgets, economic growth, even because they distort resource allocation. And lately, there's more of a knowledge of how they affect climate change through encouraging consumption and income distribution also. So we find these subsidies are an issue in many countries, practically everyone in the world, and that's what we'll show. And because subsidies have been difficult to reform, we want to take stock of what works and what doesn't. So what I'm first going to talk about is what do we understand are the consequences of energy subsidies, and then how large are these subsidies? Because what we want to do is get a more comprehensive measure of not just subsidies for gasoline, diesel, but also electricity, natural gas, and coal. And then I can talk about what we seem to see as the lessons from the past and how to do subsidy reform. We did it based on, we did case studies for 19 countries. Okay, the first point is that, of course, energy subsidies, the costs go well beyond just what they cost the budget. So, of course, they aggravate budget deficits, not only because of direct spending that's done, but also really the revenues you forego by not taxing energy at the appropriate level. So, and you'll see in this paper we're taking a very broad definition of energy subsidies to include any time you don't tax energy at the right price. In effect, you're implicitly subsidizing it because you're imposing some cost on someone and you're not paying for it. Okay, they also depress growth, and this especially has come up in the context of African countries where the amount of, for example, electricity generation and power generation per capita is very low. Subsidies, in effect, have stopped private investment in electricity, and it's a real roadblock to growth. So subsidies can just make it unattractive for both private sector and public enterprises to invest. They can also crowd out education and health spending, which can otherwise help boost growth. They lead to misallocation of resources, too many resources living just on the fact that they have access to subsidized energy, these misuse of resources. And of course, for those who are energy importers, this aggravates their balance of payments difficulties by making energy cheap and boosting their imports. And finally, they intensify climate change by encouraging energy consumption. And one of the things we've done is look at how much you could actually, how effective raising or eliminating energy subsidies would be in fighting climate change. We find that if you would eliminate what we call post-tax energy subsidies, you could lead to a very large reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, something in the order of 15%. So very large amounts then, very large even relative to, say, some of the targets that were set up in Kyoto for reducing, Copenhagen for reducing energy CO2 emissions. So actually getting rid of subsidies really should be the cornerstone of a lot of efforts to address climate change. They also widen the gap between the rich and the poor. If you look at who is it that consumes energy, they tend to, of course, go to those that consume the most energy. And when you look at who's consuming electricity, who's consuming gasoline, in the developing world, it's upper income groups. If you look at, for example, what's the share of the benefit that's directly or indirectly accrues to the top 20%, it's about 43%. So, and you look, how much does the poor gain out of this? Well, about 7%. So it's really something that reinforces a lot of inequality. Now, of course, it's still an important part of the consumption basket of the poor. So when you raise prices, it does have an adverse effect on the poor. Of course, most of the benefits of the subsidy go to the rich, so it's kind of a complicated issue, and that's, you'll see later on, we emphasize the importance of developing these mitigating measures. When you raise energy prices, you have to do something to protect the poor. And who benefits from energy subsidies? It varies by product. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, gasoline tends to be the most regressive of the benefits in terms of the share in the green here captured by the top 20%. Kerosene is less regressive. If you look at that green pie share for kerosene in the upper right, this is why we often advise countries when you're doing subsidy reform, you should probably start with the products that are consumed by the most by upper income groups. So start with gasoline. You should end up doing something like LPG and kerosene because that can tend to make it more socially acceptable and give you more of a chance in the meantime to develop safety nets. Okay, now how large are subsidies? Now first, kind of a precursor on how do we measure energy subsidies. This concept of pre-tax subsidies, we use this in its very common definition, the same as like the International Energy Agency. We call this exists whenever consumers pay a price below the supply cost of energy, including transportation and distribution costs. What this means is, let's say if you're a Middle East oil exporter, and if you sell gasoline inside your country for less than, say, the international price, we consider it a subsidy. So this is not a very popular definition with countries from the Middle East. It's really, in effect, saying this is an implicit subsidy because you could, if you sold that same product abroad, you would be able to receive that price. So regardless of how much it costs you, as long as you sell below the international price, we're going to consider that a subsidy, regardless of whether it shows up in your budget or not. Now, tax subsidies are something different. This, in effect, says we're going to call it a subsidy if energy taxes are too low. because from an ideal standpoint, energy should be taxed the same way as any other product in terms of the regular taxation on final consumption. But in addition, you should add in the adverse effects of energy consumption that's not captured in the price, that is externalities. So the adverse effect on global warming, on pollution, on congestion, on traffic fatalities, all that really should be incorporated into the price of fuel. So what's different from what we've done, what others have done, is we are in effect saying, if taxation isn't at the right level, we're going to call that a subsidy. So this is different than what, say, the International Energy Agency does, which focuses more on, say, the pre-tax subsidy concept. So then post-tax subsidies, what I'll call here, will be equal to the pre-tax tax subsidy. So in summary, anytime energy is not at the right price, we're going to call it a subsidy. Now, the data sources we used from a lot of different places. International Energy Agency we used for 39 countries for electricity, natural gas, coal. The OECD also has some subsidies meant to help producers. We took data from them. Electricity is a very difficult sector to come up with the subsidies on, because a lot of times countries, ministries of finance, don't really know what's going on with their state-owned electricity companies, only in the end when they have a huge need for a capital injection and then there's a transfer from the budget. But it's an area where really data are not that good. The bank, however, has been doing many different country studies on the electricity sector, so we gathered those together and added those in. Then we used our own estimates of the price gap approach for 176 countries. So this is a very wide-ranging data set, or that covers an awful lot of countries. On the post-tax subsidies, what we did is we looked at our estimate of pre-tax subsidies, plus we adjusted for revenue considerations and for this estimate of externalities based on the existing studies. Okay, so what are the numbers that we get? If you look at the pre-tax subsidies then, you get about close to 500 billion worldwide, which is very close to what the IEA comes up with, around 500 billion also, with, you can see, a good share for petroleum and a relatively small number for coal. So, but also substantial for electricity and natural gas as well. In terms of the regions, the MENA region accounts for about half. So this is where a lot of and especially this is coming from the oil exporters. So the oil exporters tend to have large subsidies. The advanced economies, you can see, these explicit subsidies or pre-tax subsidies are relatively small. Okay, but things change when you look then at the post-tax figure, where when you kind of look at the size, number one, looking at the size, post-tax subsidies are about 4 times as large as the pre-tax. You can even see a big change in the composition of the product, that coal is a very small amount of pre-tax subsidies, but the negative externalities from coal are very high, and you can see that it becomes about a third of the post-tax total. You still have significant amounts for petroleum. The interesting thing is, if you look across the world, practically every country has energy subsidies to some extent. So this is not just a problem of developing economies, it's the advanced economies also tend to underprice energy as well. And advanced economies account for about 40% then of the tax subsidies. So this is what is also interesting here then. It reinforces this idea that this is really a global issue. The problem sometimes with focusing then on pre-tax subsidies is you can see many times the developing economies feel like they're being targeted for these reforms, but this wider perspective makes it look as if everyone is also a subsidizer. Okay, who has the largest subsidies? If we kind of look at by region, it's still the MENA region, even with this broader post-tax concept. The MENA region subsidizes the most if we look as a percentage of GDP, and the advanced countries spend less. Then if you look at it as a percentage of revenues, which is interesting to look at in terms of how much extra revenue countries could get if they were eliminating subsidies, you can see as a percentage of revenues, it's also very high in the MENA region, very high as a share of Asia's revenues. Asia tends to be a low tax area of the world. Subsidies then would really, if they were eliminated, would give a sizable increase to their revenue levels. What is it that accounts for most of the subsidies on this post-tax basis? A lot of it is the externalities, which is the blue. So you can see the blue bar is a large share of the, if we look at it as a share of revenues, a lot of that is due to the externalities. Look at the advanced economies way at the right. Then you can see almost all of the subsidies in advanced economies come from externalities in terms of not pricing energy at the appropriate price. Okay, so that's all we have to say about the size of subsidies. Now, what have we found out works to reform subsidies? What we did is we looked at 22 different country case studies and tried to have a broad overview of both successful and unsuccessful episodes. There's been a lot more written on fuel than on electricity, so we focused on fuel, petroleum products. So we kind of looked at both the successful and partially successful, because a lot of times we find that energy subsidy reform countries go forward, then international prices rise and the political pressure heats up and they backtrack. So we wanted to look at that. And there's also been a lot of work being done by others at this point in time, and so we try to look at that as well in our own technical assistance we give to countries. Okay, what seem to be the 6 key ingredients? So one is simply have a comprehensive reform plan with really clear long-term objectives. For example, the objective could be to liberalize the fuel pricing or to improve access to electricity and increase the improve the quality of service, reduce the percentage of time people have blackouts or brownouts. So having clear long-term objectives seems to help countries kind of stick on the reform plan, because oftentimes energy subsidy reform usually takes a long time. When we looked at the successful cases, in most cases a successful reform plan takes about 5 years to implement. So it's not something you can do overnight. You also have to have an assessment of the impact of reforms, because you want to know ahead of time who is it that's benefiting from these subsidies, who's likely going to protest, what kind of mitigating measures do I have to put in place, and this is going to vary. In some countries, in Niger, it was the taxi cab drivers were going to really push back against the price increase. Government came up with a plan to address their concerns. But you have to have some kind of assessment of who benefits from the subsidies and think about then how am I going to design mitigating measures. Consultation in the same vein with stakeholders, with those large groups that actually have a lot of political clout and represent a large share of the population. The other thing you have to do is communicate, and this is, you have to have the far-reaching communication strategy. First, you have to tell the public what's the big deal with subsidies, and sometimes because subsidies are implicit, they're not always reported in the budget, people don't know that all the money that is being misallocated for subsidies. So you first have to let people know what's the size of subsidies and who would benefit from reform with very concrete examples. If you eliminate energy subsidies, we can double the number of teachers we have. If you get rid of subsidies, we'll be able to build these hospitals. You have to really lay it out in simple language and try to build a coalition in favor of this reform. You have to start reporting it in the budget. That can be helpful as well, just to strengthen that transparency. Another key ingredient is the appropriate phasing and sequencing of price increases. Why is it good to have more of a gradual path in most cases? Well, it gives households time to adjust to the changes in prices, allows them to substitute some products for others, and it lets the government try to build safety nets to help protect the poor. Sometimes it's very difficult for governments in the short run to think of what are the tools and instruments I have to protect the poor. Doing it gradually gives you more time. Now, there's always a trade-off. If you go too gradually, then your fiscal savings are going to be very slow. But as I mentioned, most successful reform episodes last 5 years. So usually it takes quite a while to do it right. in terms of sequencing the price increases, I mentioned this earlier, you probably want to start with the products that are consumed mostly by upper income groups. So start with gasoline. Don't tackle kerosene right off the bat. That's where you're going to get a lot of pushback. So fourth element. This is more to look at the producer side, to improve the efficiency of state-owned enterprises to reduce their fiscal burden. Oftentimes, we don't have very good information on what are the costs of the enterprises, and first need to have information on costs and then set targets and introduce competition where appropriate. And this, I'm saying, is often an issue in electricity, where you may have, in many parts of the world, high prices, yet despite high prices, still they need subsidies. There's a lot of inefficiency there. In many countries, it's also an issue of collecting the money that's owed. Illegal tapping into lines really can drain the finances of state-owned electricity companies. Okay, fifth measure that's important is to come up with measures to protect the poor. If possible, you want to use targeted cash transfers. But the dilemma for many countries is, okay, yes, it'd be great if we had a cash transfer program that reached people in the poorest parts of the country, but we don't. So what do? Well, sometimes you have to come up with more pragmatic programs that, such as school lunch programs. You may even just have to increase education spending to help offset the adverse effect on the poor. Countries have been inventive in trying to come up with these solutions, but still what we find in many countries is the lack of this development of a social safety net does stop governments from wanting to do subsidy reform because they know it may take time. But in the meantime, you can look at other programs that tend to reach the poor and expand them. If you raise energy prices to market levels, you may adversely affect some state-owned enterprises that then have to start paying market prices. You may need more targeted measures for them. Some countries, for example, in Iran, they gave them state-owned enterprises some temporary subsidies, loan programs. So you may adversely affect enterprises, and they may need special treatment. Okay, and the last element is to depoliticize price setting. That is, try to make fuel pricing more of an automatic a decision, not something that requires an explicit political decision. What we've been recommending countries think about is set up an automatic price mechanism, but use some price smoothing so that when international prices go up by 50%, you don't have to increase domestic prices 50%, but you have a rule that gradually passes that on, and then when prices stabilize, then you will continue to raise prices. So just try to smooth it out so over the long haul it's neutral for the budget. And it's helpful in this context to have an autonomous body oversee this price setting and really to make it, as we're saying, something out of the hands of the government and more of an automatic decision. There are some countries that have done this very well for many years. South Africa is one of them. Okay, thanks. So I'm free to take some questions now if I'll turn over to my wife.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm a student here at SEPA. I had two questions related to the quantification of tax subsidies as you reflect them in the report and the presentation. So if we just use the U.S. as an example, how do you quantify exactly the amount of tax subsidies for, let's say, fuel? I know the U.S. has much lower fuel taxes than other countries, but do you use a certain country as a baseline, or how do you know? I know you said you compare it to the way other things are taxed, but the U.S. doesn't really have a value-added tax generally. So that's the first question. And the second one is, in the report you highlight that globally fossil fuel subsidies are roughly double that of renewable energy subsidies. I was just wondering, how you go about quantifying tax benefits in that comparison related to renewable energies, for example, and as an example, quantifying the benefits within RPS or within ITCs to then bring it across and compare it to fossil fuels? Thank you.
Okay, should I take these one at a time? Sure. No, those are good questions. The quantification is based on, I guess we kind of add up then the different externalities. For example, for global warming, we follow the recent figure by the U.S. government. The interagency report came out with just adjusted the cost of carbon. Cost of damage from carbon emissions is $36 a ton in 2007 prices. So what we did is we adjusted that then, but that was the basis for looking at the effects of the price of and then we've looked at other studies looking at that relationship then between carbon emissions and damages. So that was for the carbon for the global warming element. This price has always been controversial. Economists like Nordhaus, I think, prefer a much lower number. Nicholas Stern prefers a much higher number. But I think this interagency report we followed it in our original paper, and now they've come up and revised the number upward from this $25 up to the $34, $36. So that's for just for the greenhouse gas emissions. Then there are other externalities to add in. For example, the health consequences of local pollution. These we really based on 3 studies that we know that exist for the U.S., United Kingdom, and Chile, done by Ian Perry, who's also works with us in the Fiscal Affairs Department. So we have studies based on those 3 studies looking at what are the average externalities for those three countries, and in terms of the externality per liter. What we did then is we really distributed that then across countries using some notion of the willingness to pay. And when the OECD recommends like this kind of income elasticity, this willingness to pay for pollution abatement, of about elasticity of like 0.8. And that's how we distribute it across other countries in the world based on what their GDP per capita is versus the sample of the 3 countries. Now, what we have going on right now is we're doing some work on a more refined estimates of externalities because, for example, you would expect in countries where where the population is more concentrated, then the effects of local pollution will be higher. We're kind of, for example, refining those numbers, and that's going to be a separate study that's going to come out, and they should be done by the end of this year, led by Ian Perry and others. So that was the methodology we used then basically to come up. Now in the U.S., for the revenue estimate, you're right, it's tricky because many European countries have VAT rates. In the U.S., what we did is we took the average sales tax rate, because state sales taxes seem to be really our equivalent of a consumption tax in the U.S., so we used that, and that tended to be quite a bit lower. That's only like about an average rate of 7% versus if you look in the advanced European countries, you've got average VAT rates of about 17%.
Hi, my name is Yazid Al-Rashid. I'm also a student here. My question is, how would the geographic distribution of subsidies change if you were to hypothetically define subsidies based on costs of production and not global market price?
Yeah. What that would do if you took just cost of production, it would greatly reduce the subsidy estimates in the MENA region. For sure, it's more the oil exporters. But it's very interesting if you kind of look at the developments, even in oil exporters in Saudi Arabia, for example. If you look ahead, they're forecast to be, I think, net oil importers somewhere in the future. So I think a lot of even the oil exporters are starting to take an interest in this issue because they're just seeing some of the adverse effects of high levels of consumption. Now, many of the oil exporters, though, if you look at their budgets, it seems like they don't necessarily need to raise the energy prices in terms of an immediate fiscal crisis. Many of them have low levels of public debt, and and may have actually budget surpluses due to high commodity prices, but still there are these adverse consequences from keeping low energy prices in terms of just the efficiency of their economies.
Hi, my name is Ken Kramer. I'm an alum of the B School here. My firm, Rushton Atlantic, provides valuation consulting services to the energy industry. You had spoken about, I think it's great that, you make it fairly clear that lack of a carbon tax is explicitly an energy subsidy. With all the externalities that need to be priced, I guess my first question is, do you think you're ever going to get to the right number, and does it even matter? I have seen, for example, former Congressman Bob Inglis wants to put in a revenue-neutral carbon tax. He just says start at $25, increase it, and we crunch the numbers, and here are all the good things that'll happen. So in a sense, it sounds like, maybe we don't even have to care if we ever get the number right. But I'm kind of curious how close you think you can get between, the health benefits and greenhouse gas and loss of agricultural things and, beach erosion and everything else you want to throw into the pot. My second question, more general, was you had mentioned in your 5 or 6 points all the things that would have to happen to make a correct end of subsidies politically and pragmatically doable. Do these reflect what you've observed around the world, or what percentage of these are programs that, the World Bank or IMF has actually managed to put into effect?
Okay. Thanks. In the first one, I think it still does matter, even though we measure it with a large degree of error. The point is that I think they're larger than people usually think, and also that this could be a potentially large revenue resource also for countries. So I think that's why it's still useful to kind of to in some ways get the number right from the standpoint of just its magnitude relative to other fiscal numbers. So because that can really actually help mobilize support. Also, if you say we raise energy to this correct price, and look how many more schools we can build. So I think it does matter, but I think, yes, more refined work is going to have to happen on this, and it's all subject to some uncertainty about what are the effects, but I think we still need to keep doing it. In terms of these 5 or 6 conditions to eliminate subsidies, I guess we kind of extracted these as the lessons for success based on both cases they failed and cases that succeeded. And sometimes you learn a lot from the cases that failed, because you see when governments try to rush through a plan, it usually backfires. Or if they don't really do their homework and really reaching out to the public and explaining it, it's going to fail. So it's usually, you can't rush things. And so that's what we see from a lot of the lessons of failure. Also, if you don't have these automatic pricing mechanisms in place, what we see is, for example, many cases, success and failure, like Indonesia, when international prices go up, then all of a sudden, if there's no automatic mechanism, then they backtrack on a lot of their progress. So I think we learn a lot from both the successes and the failures here. When we looked at these 28 episodes, many of them did have an IMF or World Bank supported program in terms of trying to attach some conditionality on some key reform that was needed. So usually when these energy issues are macroeconomically relevant, since that's really, the IMF is only going to look at these things if it has some kind of some tangible effect that's worth monitoring in a program. So usually these issues are important.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Weber. I'm part of the Sierra Club here in New York City, but I'm asking this question as a citizen activist. It's a question outside the box. With your experience, can you give us any ideas on how we could get a tax on carbon here in the United States, or increase the taxes on gasoline?
Yeah. I think you probably have to work on what do you do about people like my in-laws in Iowa. The whole lifestyle is generated around, driving 20 miles to work, 20, 25 miles to work. It's more designing, I think, a compensating mechanism for people who live in dispersed areas. So in Washington, D.C., it really wouldn't be that much of a bother if gasoline was $5 or $6 a gallon, but it would be in Iowa. So, but then the problem is it's going to be difficult to build the political coalition in terms of, if you think of those that have the toughest job of adapting will be those in the rural areas. So I think that's has to be the first thing, is to just figure out the cost of that, of some compensating mechanism, and then I think that would be pretty modest, actually, relative to what the revenues might be if raising energy prices. So I think that's what I would think is the first thing needed to be done.
Hi, Teal Emery. I'm a SEPA grad, and I work at Morgan Stanley. I do emerging market research. And one of the questions that I have is just maybe if you could bring us through a bit of a narrative, particularly for some of the poorest countries and ones with the least amount of state capacity, of examples of successful energy subsidy reform. And then places where in those countries, you've seen pitfalls.
Yeah. I think, and that's why I would encourage also to get the book, is that what we do is we have a number of case studies showing that, so this has worked in, say, in Africa, for example. I think if we look at Ghana, Niger, Kenya, a number of countries, and so I think the key has been often to spend some time on the things I've mentioned in terms of consultation with stakeholders. Communication strategies have always been important. So that in the electricity sector also, it's been very important to tell citizens that I'm raising prices, but I promise to improve the quality of service. Because usually, a lot of times, even, and this has happened also in Eastern Europe, when you've been able to say, look, I'm raising prices, but now we're going to increase access, and we're going to be able to actually improve on services. This, in electricity, this seems to have been the key, is to really actually improve the quality of service and not just think that the only objective here is to raise price and reduce the fiscal bleeding. So I think there are we have a number of successes that, and even then, I'm saying in countries that didn't have really a far-flung social safety net. But the key element, I really think, is this communication and and talking with people. The problem is if the country doesn't have a very kind of democratic, or let's say it doesn't have a tradition of dialogue with stakeholders, then in some ways we're saying, I want you to do something that really should be part and parcel of your normal budget process, and that's, I think, what can be difficult for countries.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Max Pijor. I'm an occasional contributor analyst to RBN Energy. My question ties in, I think, with some of the other people here. The lady asked about the United States. I think one other gentleman, the person just before me, referenced case studies. In my case, I'm interested in 4 particular countries: Iran, Nigeria, Argentina, and Ukraine. I know in the case of Ukraine, there's an active IMF program there. I'm not sure if there is with the other 3 countries that I mentioned. 2 are particularly interesting, Iran and Nigeria, because they're energy producers and exporters. In Iran, you have a remarkable distortion of the way things have been developed. You export crude oil, you have to import fuels for the automobiles, and to wean off people from fuels, you have a very screwball implementation of a natural gas automobile system. Argentina has something similar. Anyway, so those are of my interest, but I don't know what's directly of you, what you could respond to. And if they're covered in the book, I'm more than willing to buy the book also. So
Okay. Very good. Say on Iran, we do have a case study there, and actually it was more of a, I mean, before the sanctions, actually it was, many people were citing it as a very innovative approach where what they did is they said, well, we don't really need to raise energy prices for the budget, but it's leading to all these distortions, and they set up a cash transfer system that really almost overcompensated people and actually created such a political goodwill and interest that people were pushing the government, please raise energy prices. What they would do is they made sure everyone in the country practically had bank accounts, and then they would place the money in the bank account and freeze it, in effect sequester it then until the price increase happened. And that seemed to be very successful. So it didn't save a lot of money in terms of for the fiscal sector, because everything they gained from higher prices they practically gave back in terms of these cash transfers. But it did show how you can move forward on this. Nigeria also, I mean, is been. We have a case study there. It's been a very interesting case because there the big problem is just credibility of the government. That everyone knows that, yes, who is it that benefits from subsidized energy? People know it's more upper income groups, but they don't believe that if the government has more resources that they'll spend it on something that's worthwhile for them. So it's kind of wrapped up in this whole general credibility problem that's big. But still, I mean, so Nigeria is an interesting case of where, I mean, I think they raised prices, they backtracked a little bit, but still on net, I think they've made an improvement. And this is where, I mean, they didn't do a good enough job on the communication strategy. They moved too fast. So, and Ukraine, we don't have the study in the book, but I think natural gas subsidies are, of course, the big issue there that for many years.
Since it's not in the book, there's a good working paper. The author's names are last names are Mitra and Toy.
Yeah. That exactly, and I think that basically I think well describes still the challenges of if you raise natural gas prices, and then the challenge is then setting up the safety net then to compensate people for it. But Argentina, we have not looked at very extensively.
Hi, my name is Abhijit. I'm doing my master's in economic policy management here with a specialization in energy. Thank you for a very insightful speech, insightful presentation. My specific question, we talked about taxes and we talked even about subsidies and the way what's IMF's view on both these policy instruments. My question is specifically to what's IMF and your view on the global cap and trade system for carbon emissions. And to be more specific, during the glory years of the Kyoto Protocol, when also the 2 years when even Australia and Japan became part of Australia, Japan, and Canada was part of it, where there was actually transactions happening and there were emission reduction projects getting augmented in the emerging countries. Was there a notable quantifiable impact on reduction in subsidies as well as carbon tax instruments which were used in specifically emerging countries? And was there a positive backlash of that for the more advanced countries? Thanks.
Yeah. Yes. I don't think the effect of that was so sizable to have an effect on say subsidy policy in either the advanced or the emerging economies. In terms of cap and trade, I think like emission trading is fine, but there has to be a floor. And you see what's happened now is that the whole system has collapsed in Europe. But I think the price is $6 now. I mean, the Australians come closer to something more reasonable in the 20s. I mean, the problem is then emission, and then the problem then is right now is the price is too low in terms of implicitly it's saying the cost of damage is what the market will bear. There should be instead a floor. So $6 is obviously way too low. The other thing that's important as a principle is that, I mean, countries shouldn't give away these emission rights. I mean, right now it's as if, I mean, with supply and demand, you're just giving away too many rights that so in effect, people should have to pay for them, and that's really leading to actually, I think, the system not working. And the third principle really, I think, should be that you should use this for fiscal revenues. That is, you should charge people for it, and then use the fiscal and use that as part of a fiscal dividend. So the problem has been more giving them away, and prices are just too low. So the emission trading system really has not worked because of that. Yeah, I mean, I think still the principle is going to have to be that to set a floor. I mean, because the problem is, yes, if advanced countries are in crisis, they have low energy demand. I mean, the price goes down. The problem is, how are you going to make sure people really price in energy thinking of the impact of their energy consumption on future generations? So I think you really have to. This market can only work if you impose these floors and not let the price fall too low.
My name is Walter Goldstein. Up to this last point where you talk about a national debate and how not to give away things, it is a little like listening to the Congress debating the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. Everyone's got an idea what it ought to be, but there are no definitions. The question I bring up is one methodology. There's an enormous literature about the definition of free trade. The World Trade Organization has been in operation for 50 years or so, and an attempt to try and define what are the rules of trade. There is no agreement, starting with the critical issue at the beginning. When does a nation devalue its currency? Because this can be the greatest steal of the lot. And the second, obviously, comes in terms not only of the externalities, but with the devaluation of the currency, the question that you deal with at the IMF, which is the measurement of purchasing power parities. And then until you've come up with some definition here, it becomes very, very difficult to work out what are the metrics that you're using. And I remind you that for 20 or 30 years, the Chinese delegation said that the IMF figures about per capita GDP and on a later stage of purchasing power parities were out of all notion of reality, because in the West we calculated they were a heck of a lot richer than they said they were, and the argument still continues. Well, there's one source of literature maybe to look at, and that was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in which we had this tear-down argument with the Canadians and the Mexicans, who are by far and away the most important customers of the United States, as to what should be agreed and what shouldn't. The stumbling point with Canada was that they included all of their health costs in looking at cost ratios and this metric. So the question I would put is not one of where are you going on this, but of the methodology. Is there something you can learn from the World Trade Organization and NAFTA which would help pare down the data that you need to look at, the factor analysis, in a way which will clarify? We want to move to a world of an organized market price in order to get some notion of parity, of even of justice in doing so. Do you envisage this as a doable thing as your studies accumulate? Because of what the World Trade Organization, there is a suspicion that since the Doha conference, which was so ambitious and which failed, that WTO may be failing too. What do you learn from that?
I think in some ways, I'm not sure how much our analysis changes based on whether we're a correction for GDP and PPP terms would change things that much, because in some ways, what we're doing is we're looking at, say, the effect of subsidies based on, and then looking at national as a share of GDP at national prices. I mean, if we looked at, say, some of these charges then and weighted it and divided by GDP and PPP terms, that could, in fact, in this case, this would actually, I think, could change some of the estimates. But I think still we're looking at this issue more from the standpoint of, is it in the country's own best interest? And many of, I'd say, our externality numbers, some are greenhouse gas emissions, which are more of a global externality, but a lot of what we're saying is the externalities are local congestion, local pollution. So in some ways, we're saying those costs are national. So I mean, measuring it differently in a different GDP in terms of doing a correction for PPP, I'm not sure it's going to change the story that much.
My name is Minan Omar. I'm a SIPA alumni, and my question was specifically on a country like Egypt, where, given the high level of poverty in this country, a lot of people, or the government itself, would benefit from removing the subsidies. At the same time, removing subsidies, whether on fuels or bread, has always been a very sensitive topic. It's been extremely difficult to liberalize the electricity market, to remove any of the subsidies. So how to go about this, especially in this period of political transition, at a time where the economy is taking a deep dive down? And also, what are your views on subsidizing renewables, whether it's in Egypt, a country that has a high potential, or in general? Does any of the recommendations, look into this issue? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. First, in terms of Egypt, it faces this. The main challenge there is putting in place the mitigating measures. I mean, for a few years now, they've still been working very closely with the World Bank on implementing more of a smart card program that would then allow some targeted transfer to affected groups. But this has been a case where the government wanted to reform, but they could not move that quickly because just reaching that many millions of people in a short amount of time, it was just too difficult. So I think for them it's similar challenges to what we've talked about. There has to be communication about these are the benefits of subsidy reform, and we're going to be and that many parts of the population are going to be protected, and we have the following transfer program to protect you. So I think it's more a matter of getting that in place. But given all the political turmoil, et cetera, many changes in the ministers of finance I think the ministers of finance are changing every 6 months. It's very hard to kind of get the continuity to go forward on these things. In terms of subsidizing renewables, I think in some ways, yes, one could see that in some ways that you're subsidizing renewables offsets the fact that you're subsidizing you're subsidizing gasoline prices by not taxing it appropriately. So that standpoint, you could think, well, there's some justification there. But we did actually some research on what are the determinants of green investment. We published a paper in Energy Policy on that, looking at what gets countries moving, let's say, to invest in green energy. One of them is kind of the mandates with the feed-in rules, but the other thing is actually the price of energy matters too. So I really think if you want to spur renewables, the best thing is to raise the price of gasoline, raise the price of traditional energy sources, and that probably will be the best stimulus for the renewables.
Thank you very much. I would like also to thank you for the questions that were very interesting, and thank you.